Hey everyone, welcome to a deep dive. It's going to be pretty personal and a complex one too. We're looking at multiple sclerosis, or MS for short. And I know you've all got your research articles and videos ready to go, maybe even some notes you've jotted down. You might be here because MS has touched your life. Or maybe you're on the path to becoming a doctor, or hey, maybe you're just super curious like me.
You know, what makes MS so fascinating and challenging at the same time is that it's not the same for everyone. You could say it's a complicated dance between your genes, the environment, and your immune system. And it plays out differently for each person.
Okay, I'm already hooked. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is MS? I was watching this Mayo Clinic video, and they use this analogy of the myelin sheath. You know, it's like the insulation on electrical wires. They said MS damages that insulation, so signals get all messed up in the brain and the spinal cord. But it's our own immune system doing the damage, isn't it?
It's like your immune system, which is supposed to be protecting you, suddenly decides to turn against you. So that's why we call MS an autoimmune disease.
Okay, so it's like friendly fire gone wrong. And I remember from one of the osmosis videos, they talked about T cells and B cells attacking the myelin. Like, imagine a bouncer letting way too many people into a club. Total chaos, right? But how are these cells supposed to work, like, in a normal immune system?
Okay, so in a healthy immune system, T cells and B cells are like security guards, right? Patrolling around your body looking for threats, like viruses and bacteria. And they help to neutralize those threats, keep you healthy. But in MS, these cells, they mistakenly think that myelin is the enemy, so they launch this attack against it.
Wow, it's like a case of mistaken identity. But at the cellular level, that's crazy. And that's what sets off all those MS symptoms, right? This interview with Dr. Gang from Ohio State really got me thinking, though. He made it clear that MS isn't directly inherited, like some other conditions. So if it's not passed down directly, what's the deal with the genetic component?
It's more about predisposition. You might inherit some genes that make you a bit more likely to develop MS, but those genes alone, they won't cause the disease. It's this combination of genes and environmental triggers, like maybe certain viruses or even a vitamin D deficiency, that researchers are still trying to piece together.
So it's not as simple as saying, if your parent has MS, you'll definitely get it. It's more like, I don't know, like a roll of the dice where your genes kind of load the dice, but the environment ultimately determines the outcome.
Exactly. And that's what makes MS research so complex, but so important. Because if we can understand those environmental triggers, that could be the key to prevention or even finding a cure.
Okay, so we've got the basics of what's happening at the cellular level, but let's talk about what this actually looks and feels like. You know, for people living with MS, the Baptist Health video mentions all these early symptoms: weakness, fatigue, weird sensory stuff, even mood swings. It's kind of all over the place, isn't it?
It is, and that's one of the things that makes MS so difficult to diagnose early on. These initial symptoms.
Yeah.
They can be pretty subtle, easily mistaken for something else.
Yeah, it's like a chameleon, blending in, making it hard to spot. But even though the early signs can be vague, I was struck by how those seemingly minor symptoms are actually linked to some serious stuff happening in the nervous system. Take fatigue, for example. It's common in a lot of conditions. But in MS, it's not just about being tired.
No, that fatigue can be so debilitating. It can make everyday activities feel impossible.
Yeah.
And it all stems from the damage to those nerve pathways, the ones responsible for transmitting messages throughout the body.
So it's not just about needing a good night's sleep. It's a direct result of those faulty signals in the nervous system that really highlights the connection between these seemingly minor symptoms and the underlying damage caused by MS. And speaking of the nervous system going haywire, I gotta ask about those bizarre symptoms, the ones that Dr. Boster describes in his YouTube video. Some of this stuff sounds like it's straight out of a science fiction movie.
Yeah, Dr. Bose's video definitely goes beyond the typical textbook description of MS. He talks about the weird and often terrifying symptoms that a lot of people experience.
He really does, and that's what I appreciate about his approach. It's honest and raw, which is so valuable for those living with MS, and for anyone trying to understand the true impact of this disease. But before we get into those less common symptoms, I want to talk about the different types of MS. The osmosis video explains them. They talk about relapsing-remitting, secondary progressive, primary progressive. It seems like there's a whole spectrum of how this disease can play out.
There is, and that's why it's so important to understand those different types, because they can have such a huge impact on someone's experience and treatment plan.
Okay, so let's break that down. What are the key differences between these MS types, and how does understanding these different pathways help with treatment? Okay, so we were just talking about the different types of MS. and how understanding those variations is super important for creating these personalized treatment plans. Can you walk us through those types and explain how they differ in terms of, progression and symptoms and all that?
Absolutely. So the most common type is relapsing-remitting MS. And with this type, you have these distinct periods of flare-ups, or relapses, followed by periods of remission, where symptoms get better, or they might even disappear completely.
So it's like this back and forth, riding these unpredictable waves of relapses. But what's actually happening in the body during those relapses? Is it like the immune system launching a new attack each time?
Yeah, exactly. During a relapse, the immune system is actively attacking the myelin, causing inflammation and new damage. But then and we don't fully understand why, the immune system calms down. And that allows for some repair and recovery.
Okay, that makes sense. So with relapsing-remitting MS, it's like this constant battle between damage and repair. But what about the progressive types of MS? They seem a bit more, I don't know, daunting from what I've read.
Yeah, they can be. In progressive forms of MS, there's this steady worsening of symptoms over time, with fewer or even no periods of remission. And there are a couple of different subtypes within this category.
Okay, let's break those down. I remember the osmosis video mentions secondary progressive MS. How is that different from the relapsing-remitting type?
Well, secondary progressive MS, it often develops after a period of relapsing-remitting MS. It's like the disease transitions from that cycle of flare-ups and remissions to a more steady decline.
So it's like those periods of recovery, they become less and less frequent, and the damage starts to build up faster. That sounds really tough.
It can be. And then there's primary progressive MS, which is basically a slow, steady progression of disability from the very beginning, without those distinct relapses and remissions.
Okay, so with primary progressive MS, it's like you're starting on that downward slope right away. And then there's progressive relapsing MS, which, if I'm getting this right, it's kind of a combo of both, right?
Exactly. Progressive relapsing MS is the rarest form, and it involves that steady progression of disability from the start, but with those relapses happening along the way.
Wow, that sounds particularly challenging. Okay, so we've got these different types of MS, each with its own progression and symptoms. But regardless of the type, there's this common thread of nerve damage and disruption in the brain and spinal cord. And I'm guessing that's where those mind-boggling symptoms come in, the ones Dr. Boster talks about, right?
Exactly, those symptoms. As strange as they sound, they all come down to damage to specific nerves and pathways in the central nervous system.
Okay, so let's dive into those, because I think this is where things get really interesting and honestly a little unsettling. Dr. Boster mentions optic neuritis, which I know can cause vision problems, but he describes this intense pain with eye movement, almost like you're feeling a tug on your optic nerve. Why does that happen?
Well, it's because the optic nerve, which carries visual information from your eye to your brain, it gets inflamed, and that inflammation puts pressure on the nerve, causing pain, especially when you move your eyes.
So it's not just blurry vision, it's this excruciating pain that must make it so hard to even function. And then there's trigeminal neuralgia, which he describes as one of the most intense pains a human can experience. It's like the sudden jolt of electricity in the face. I can't even imagine.
It's a sharp, stabbing pain.
Yeah.
And it can be triggered by the slightest touch, even just a breeze on your face. And it comes from irritation or damage to the trigeminal nerve, which is responsible for sensation in the face.
Wow, that sounds absolutely debilitating. And then there's Laryngecine, which Dr. Boster says makes some people feel like Frankenstein. It's that electric shock down the spine when you bend your neck. I'm assuming that's nerve-related too, right?
It is. That electric sensation is caused by damage to the myelin in the spinal cord. And any movement that stretches the spinal cord, like bending your neck, can trigger that shock.
Okay, so we've got pain with eye movement, jolts of electricity in the face, and Frankenstein-like shocks down the spine. And then there's the MS hug, which sounds terrifying. He describes it as this feeling of being squeezed, like a boa constrictor's wrapping around your chest.
It's a very real and often frightening symptom. It comes from spasms in the muscles around the chest or abdomen. It can be so intense that people mistake it for a heart attack.
Oh my gosh, I can see why that would be so scary. And then there's these weird sensory distortions. He calls them dysesthesias. Burning, freezing, crushing sensations. It's like your own body is betraying you. What's going on there?
Those dysesthesias, they're a result of damage to the nerves themselves. The nerves misfire, sending these faulty signals to the brain, which interprets them as pain, or burning, or other strange sensations.
So it's like your brain is getting these garbled messages, and it doesn't know how to make sense of them, so it defaults to pain or these bizarre feelings. And then, to top it all off, Dr. Boster mentions this unbearable itch called pathologic itching. It's an itch you can't scratch because it's caused by nerve damage. It's just mind-blowing how much damage MS can do to the nervous system.
It really does highlight the complexity and the interconnectedness of the nervous system. Even seemingly minor damage to one area can have these huge effects on sensation, movement, even our emotional well-being.
It's a reminder of how much we rely on our nervous system for literally everything we do, think and feel. Okay, so we've covered a lot of challenging stuff, but I know you're a big believer in the power of knowledge and finding ways to manage even the most difficult situations. So let's talk about what can be done to help those living with MS. The Mayo Clinic video highlights these multidisciplinary teams that are working together to manage the disease, and they specifically mention physiatrists. Now, I'll admit, that's not a term I'm totally familiar with.
You're not alone. A physiatrist is a doctor who specializes in physical medicine and rehabilitation. They focus on restoring function and improving quality of life for people with conditions that affect their mobility and independence, like MS.
Okay, so they're all about helping people regain as much function and independence as possible, even with these challenging symptoms. And the Mayo Clinic video also talks about physical therapists and occupational therapists being really important in this team approach.
Absolutely. Physical therapists help people improve their strength, flexibility, and balance, which can be crucial for managing mobility issues. And occupational therapists focus on adapting everyday activities like dressing, bathing, or cooking, so people can maintain their independence, even with limitations.
It's like this whole team of experts working together to address every aspect of life with MS. And I remember Dr. Yang mentioning this quality of life clinic at Ohio State. That takes this holistic approach to a whole new level.
Yes, Dr. Gang's clinic is a great example of patient-centered care. They offer not just physical therapy and rehab, but also mental health support, which is so important for people coping with the emotional toll of MS.
It's recognizing that MS affects the whole person, not just their physical body. So offering mental health support alongside those medical treatments seems super important. And I love that they encourage patients to connect with others through support groups.
Yeah, that peer support can be so valuable. It's a chance to share experiences, learn coping strategies, and realize that you're not alone in this journey.
It's that sense of community, that shared understanding that can be so empowering. Okay, so we've got these multidisciplinary teams, these holistic clinics, and these support communities. But what about actual treatments? Are there ways to slow down the progression of MS or even potentially reverse some of the damage?
There are, yeah. While we haven't found a way to completely cure MS yet, the good news is there are treatments to manage symptoms, slow down progression, and even help repair some of the damage.
Okay, that is good news. I know the Mayo Clinic video mentioned something called disease-modifying therapies, or DMTs. What exactly are those and how do they work?
So DMTs are basically medications that target the immune system dysfunction, the root cause of MS. They work in different ways. Some reduce inflammation, others prevent immune cells from getting to the brain and spinal cord, and some even promote nerve cell repair.
So it's like attacking the disease from multiple angles, trying to outsmart those immune cells. Do these DMTs work for all types of MS?
They're most effective for relapsing-remitting MS. They can significantly reduce the frequency and severity of those relapses. And they can also slow down the progression to secondary progressive MS.
Okay, so for those with relapsing-remitting MS, these DMTs offer a real shot at keeping things under control. But what about the progressive types? Are there any options for those?
Yeah, there are. While DMTs might not be as effective for primary or secondary progressive MS, there are other medications that can help, specifically to manage symptoms and improve quality of life. For example, there are drugs to help with fatigue, muscle spasms, and bladder problems.
So even though stopping the progression might be tougher in those cases, there are still ways to help people live more comfortably. I remember reading about some research into new therapies. Are there any promising avenues you're excited about?
Oh, absolutely. There's so much exciting research happening right now. Stem cell therapy is generating a lot of buzz. Researchers are looking into using stem cells to repair damaged myelin and maybe even regenerate nerve cells.
Stem cell therapy, that sounds futuristic, like something out of a sci-fi movie. How does that even work?
Well, the idea is to use stem cells, which have this amazing ability to develop into different types of cells, to replace the damaged cells in the nervous system. It's still early days, but some studies are showing some promising results.
Wow, so they're trying to reprogram these stem cells to become healthy myelin-producing cells, and then transplant them into the damaged areas. That's incredible.
It is. And it's not just stem cell therapy. There's also a lot of research on personalized medicine. tailoring treatments to an individual's genes and how their disease is progressing.
Personalized medicine, so like a custom-designed treatment plan based on your specific MS profile, that's amazing. How are they figuring out those personalized approaches?
Researchers are using all sorts of tools, like genetic testing, analysis of the immune system, and even studying the gut microbiome, to identify markers that can predict how someone's MS will progress and which treatments will work best for them.
Wait, the gut microbiome, you mean the bacteria in our gut could play a role in MS?
It's a fascinating area of research.
Yeah.
It seems that the balance of bacteria in our gut
Yeah.
can affect inflammation throughout the body, which could have implications for autoimmune diseases like MS.
That's mind-blowing. So by understanding someone's gut microbiome, they might be able to develop personalized therapies that target gut bacteria to reduce inflammation and maybe even slow down MS progression.
Exactly. It's a whole new frontier in MS research, and it highlights how interconnected our bodies really are.
It's like we're moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach to healthcare and towards a more personalized, targeted approach that takes all the individual factors into account. That brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the social and emotional aspects of living with MS. We talked about Dr. Yang's Quality of Life Clinic, which offers mental health support and encourages patients to connect with others through support groups. But what can we do on a larger scale to better support those living with this complex disease?
That's a really important question. We need to start thinking about MS differently, not just as a medical issue, but also recognizing its social and emotional impact. We need to create a more inclusive and supportive environment where people with MS feel valued, understood, and empowered.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? What changes can we make as individuals and as a society to create that kind of supportive environment?
Well, it starts with awareness. The more we understand about MS, the better we can challenge misconceptions and break down stigma. So talking about MS openly, sharing stories, and educating ourselves are all important.
It's about making the conversation around MS normal, so people feel comfortable talking about their experiences and seeking support.
Exactly. And then there's accessibility. We need to make sure physical spaces and social environments are accessible to people of all abilities. And that's not just about ramps and wheelchair access. It's about creating a culture of inclusivity where everyone feels welcome and supported.
It's about recognizing that accessibility is a human right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we also need to advocate for policies that support people with disabilities, like affordable healthcare, accessible transportation, and job opportunities.
It's about creating a society where everyone can thrive, regardless of their physical challenges.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's about recognizing the humanity of those living with MS grip, seeing them as individuals with strengths, talents, and aspirations, not just as patients or people with disabilities.
It's about celebrating their resilience, their courage, and their determination to live full lives.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into multiple sclerosis.
Wow, that was quite a journey. We covered so much. From the tiny workings of the immune system to the big impact MS has on people's lives.
We explored the latest research, the challenges of managing symptoms, and the incredible resilience of those living with this disease.
And I think what I'll take away from this is the importance of hope. Hope for scientific breakthroughs and for a more inclusive and compassionate world.
Hope is so important. As we go forward, let's remember what we've learned, the connections we've made, and the inspiration we've found.
Let's keep exploring, learning, and advocating for a future where MS is no longer a life-limiting diagnosis, but a chance for growth, community, and positive change.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.